So let's keep talking about ethics and let's talk about when you have bad ethics, is it bad business? And we actually find a fair amount of support for this concept that when organizations basically do not support their ethical codes, have not created an ethical structure based on the morals of the situation or civilization or culture that they're within, and then do not encourage both decisions and behaviors that support that ethical behavior, we find a wide range of negative outcomes, including a large percentage of people considering switching to another company. So basically, customers will often consider a organization that has been identified as having bad ethics. They're much more likely to seek out other services. They may speak out about the company amongst family and friends. They may refuse to invest in that company's stock. They may refuse to work at that company, may boycott that company's products. And if they are working at that company, are more or less likely to be loyal to that company. All of these are at over 50%, and some of them are close to 100%. So again, we can see that there are definite costs to being unethical. So that means that organizations have a fair amount of pressure to enforce ethical policies. Within the United States, there's a fair amount of actual laws, including federal sentencing guidelines, which holds corporate boards accountable for the actions of the organizations they oversee, lead organizations in clearly outlining ethical standards for behavior. So federal sentencing guidelines basically says that you can be held accountable for ethical violations of the company that you lead. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act focuses additional on accounting practices and has caused firms to change the way they account for businesses as well as audit their business practices. And there's two key areas there: limited acceptance of entertainment and gifts by employees. So basically making sure that people aren't being bribed regularly to make decisions, and increased accurate company performance documentation standards. So basically keeping track of how people are performing and how the organization is giving out awards. All of those are now legally constrained by federal law, which then forces or basically informs the ethical standards within organizations. So there's additional civil liberty under that act. So no publicly traded company or officer, employee, contractor, subcontractor, or agent of such company may discharge, demote, suspend, threaten, harass, or in any other manner discriminate against an employee in the terms of conditions of employment because of a lawful act done by that employee. So basically what that means is that if an individual within an organization behaves legally and ethically, but potentially against the expectations of their superiors, they cannot be actually punished for such behavior. In fact, they should be rewarded. This is a fancy way to say this is basically a protection of whistleblowers. And additionally, to provide information, cause information to be provided, or otherwise assist in an investigation regarding the conduct of an employee reasonably believes constitutes a violation of a rule or regulation of the SEC, and any provision of federal law relating to fraud against stakeholders, federal criminal provisions prohibiting mail fraud, bank fraud, fraud by wire, fraud by radio, fraud by television, etc. So again, there's a fair amount of protections that make sure that individuals within an organization, even if the organization is not behaving ethically, can be protected from retribution if they behave ethically. We want to make sure, though, that ethics, especially in international arena, are flexible. And I don't mean flexible in such a way that they are breaking expected laws, but basically they need to live somewhere in a continuum between ethical relativism. In other words, when in Rome, behave as Rome. So if you're in a culture that allows bribery, you should allow bribery. So there's basically no internationally accepted standards of right and wrong. The problem with this is most organizations do exist in some form at a headquarters, and that headquarters is usually responsible for the actions legally of their various branches throughout the world. Therefore, ethical relativism is rarely the way you want to be ethically within your organization. But additionally, ethical imperialism, what is different may be considered wrong. The ethical standards of one's own country are considered most appropriate at all times, can also become too restrictive. And again, it's up to the organization to decide how they're going to create an ethical document that basically straddles these two concerns. The main idea of the global principles of a global ethical policy is to show respect for those core human values, to demonstrate sensitivity to local traditions within the legal constraints that the company is bound by, and to recognize that context matters when distributing between right and wrong within organizations. So this is the challenge that a lot of organizations have in creating their ethical documentation, and deciding on what is considered ethical is, again, trying to balance these two processes on this continuum. So unethical behavior definitely has situational determinants. Managers' value sometimes discourages ethical behavior. So managerial values, whether they support or refute unethical behavior, have a strong impact on those that work within and under them within an organization. And there's a couple of kind of philosophies that come in here. One is managers with a bottom line mentality. In other words, as long as we're making money, that's all that matters. Again, that is not going to, that kind of a managerial viewpoint is not going to result in employees behaving ethically. There's also the exploitive mentality. I'm really not that concerned with making money for the organization, but I am concerned with doing whatever is right for me. It's all about oneself. And again, when we have a manager that's their mindset, that is going to set up a situation where most people are going to be less likely to behave ethically. And finally, there's kind of Madison Avenue mentality, social perceptions. Whatever's right is what I can convince people is right. In other words, if I do something unethical, all I need to do is make sure that everyone agrees that it was the right decision, and then I'm fine. So all three of these are negative behaviors, negative decisions people are making based on ethics, which result in negative behaviors. But it's not just their behaviors. If they're in management positions, it's also encouraging others to behave that way as well. Basically, research has found very strongly that subordinates tend to emulate the manager's unethical behavior. Again, not everyone, but a lot of people base their ethical behaviors on social conventions. And social conventions include what our managers are doing. So how do we combat this? Generally through corporate ethical programs. And the components include such things as a code of ethics, a document describing what an organization stands for, and the general rules of conduct it expects for its employees. These codes of ethics will also usually include what are the penalties for violating the code of ethics, and what are the benefits of following the code of ethics. Once that code is in place, usually there is going to be ethical training. So training on ethical issues, increasing the effectiveness of the codes of ethics. So not just stating them, but also training people. In my current workplace, I usually have to do 2 to 3 ethical trainings a year, generally about when can I accept gifts, how can I use or how can I distribute contracts, and also how should I behave when I'm dealing with other cultures. Those are all trainings that I've gone through on a yearly basis to make sure I understand the ethical expectations of my company. And then beyond that, we need an enforcement body. So official bodies formally responsible for ethics, ethical officers, individuals usually at the vice presidential level who oversee the ethics of a company's operation and also oversee the process of oversight and complaint. So if someone thinks there's an ethical violation, who do they go to and how do they start that investigation? So continuing on these components of ethical programs, we need mechanisms for communicating these ethical standards. So not only are we creating an ethical code, not only are we providing training, we also need to make sure people have easy access to these ethical standards. And this can include newsletters, meetings, creation of ethical hotlines. And then we also need to do ethical audits. So not only training and having an enforcement, but also going through the process of actively investigating and documenting incidents of dubious ethical value within a company. All of these result in overall a better movement from that morals to ethics to decision to behaviors. These are methods to create a situation that encourages decisions that match the ethical code, followed by behaviors that match the ethical code. Unfortunately, what research has found over and over again is good ethics is good for business. Generally speaking, organizations that are perceived as having high ethical standards and perform in an ethical way typically have overall long-term improved financial performance. They tend to have reduced operating costs. They tend to have an enhanced corporate reputation, which also means market share usually goes up, which is that increased ability to attract and retain employees. So across the board, companies with good ethics and a good ethical process and a good perception that people understand what the ethics are, people understand why they should follow the ethics, and people understand the benefit of following the ethics will result in a lot of positive outcomes for that organization. And just a little example from studies that we've done on ethical programs effectiveness. Generally, again, what we found is that we talked about a bit about Kohlberg's theory of pre-conventional versus conventional. So pre-conventional is basically people that are 100% only willing to actually behave if they know they have to, and if they're going to be rewarded for it or punished if they don't. People that are more at the conventional level are less likely to behave immorally and are more likely to behave properly simply because it's a social convention. And what we find is that with no ethical program in place, we generally find that those people, there's not a lot of difference between pre-conventional and conventional people. In other words, if we're actually looking at the number of things that are stolen within a study, whether someone's at the pre-conventional level or the conventional level, we find about the same amount of theft. If we include an ethics program, the ethics program tends to not actually have an effect on people at the pre-conventional level. We find the same amount of theft is occurring. However, it has a strong effect on those at the conventional level. Now, remember again that according to Kohlberg's theory, about 1/3 of the adult population is at that pre-conventional level, but 2/3 is at that conventional level. So though ethical programmings and ethical programs, ethical training is not necessarily going to have an impact on everyone, it does have an impact on the majority of people within an organization in a positive way.